Picture this, you're 19 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you, and it's looking very promising. You've just been promoted at work, and you're just about to get married to the love of your life. And then you have it all taken away from you. You're carted off and falsely imprisoned as a political prisoner. You're locked up, and you are robbed of years of your life due to the scheming of a group of backstabbing men. After an understandable period of despair, you find yourself faced with the need to forge yourself, to be reborn, and of course to escape and wreak your revenge. This is the story of Alexandre Dumas, the Count of Monte Cristo. First published serially from 1844 to 1846, this swashbuckling, rip-roaring adventure read was partly responsible for shooting Alexandre Dumas to international fame. And indeed, if you find that the story grabs hold of you and drags you along at breakneck speed, then this is testament to the great writer's compositional process. Alexandre Dumas, a man who lived a life that could have very well made it into one of his books, would travel across Europe writing multiple stories simultaneously, and he would leave a blaze of words, creditors and mistresses in his wake. Dumas wrote at a furious pace, and due to the nature of the story, it's very plot-driven, it's filled with exciting incidents, and it's stuffed with cliffhangers. Due to the nature of the story, readers consistently find themselves swept up in the excitement and inhaling the book feverishly. And there is clearly something about this story thematically that resonates with all of us, because indeed the Count of Monte Cristo has never been out of print. It has been reissued, retranslated and readapted endlessly. I think we all relate to and feel like the central protagonist from time to time. We all feel like Edmond Dantès. We've all felt the sting of injustice and the thirst to have a wrong righted. We've all felt trapped and felt the painful necessity to break free. And because we are now kicking off a lecture series and read-through of the Count of Monte Cristo at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, let's talk today about how you can make your engagement with Alexandre Dumas' great work meaningful, rewarding and inspiring. Okay, the first thing you want to do is choose the right translation. We're beginning with the practicalities, but this is a very important part of the process, because the difference between a good translation and a bad translation is essentially the difference between falling madly in love with a book that you want to reread endlessly over the course of your life and abandoning the book, putting it down and not even finishing it. Choosing the right translation makes all the difference. And I've spoken before about my translation philosophy. I am not a purist. I am perhaps what John Rutherford would call a cavalier. In his introduction to Don Quixote, he spoke about cavaliers versus Puritans. There are some translations that try to stick rigidly to the original text in service of being faithful, whatever that means. Now that can be a good thing, but if you do not give yourself enough wiggle room as a translator, it's not going to sound too natural in the target language, the language you're translating to, in this case, English. The right translation is the one that gets you into the story. So we're going to do a little taste test comparing two popular translations so you can see which one works for you. I will say from the outright, however, that my personal recommendation is in the Penguin edition, which you can see behind me, translated by Robin Buss. This, in my opinion, is the best translation. And I think you can always tell when somebody has chosen a bad translation, because I'll have readers say to me, oh, I couldn't enjoy Don Quixote, I couldn't get through War and Peace, and I'll do some probing and I'll find that for Don Quixote they're reading the motto, which is a bad decision, or for War and Peace they haven't gone for the Anthony Briggs, which makes the language more accessible, it makes it modern, it makes it easier to read essentially. And when people say they can't get into the Count of Monte Cristo, I know that they're most likely not reading the Robin Buss translation. Now the Count of Monte Cristo has a very rich translation history, but it would be an 1846 anonymous translation, published by Chapman and Hall, and Charles Dickens fans will recognise that publisher's name. It would be this anonymous translation that would prove to be influential, setting the standards for every English translation to come. Now, I say setting the standards, but that anonymous translation is a bit stiff. It feels very strange to read it. It's very cumbersome. It's not written in natural English. Essentially, you can tell it's a translation, which, in my opinion, is not what you want from a translated work of literature. But most new translations, and I use the word new loosely, are quite significantly based on that anonymous translation. And so, if you come across the Oxford World's Classics editions in your hunt for your own edition, then this is based on that anonymous translation too. Now, the reason why I prefer the Robin Buss translation is it's more of a joy to read. And reading the Count of Monte Cristo should be a joy. It should be an exhilarating adventure. You don't want to have your enjoyment slowed down, trying to work out some unnatural lexical choices and strange syntax. So Robin Buss deliberately tried to make his translation more accessible, more modern, and swapped in a lot more modern phrasings and removed some of the archaic tone from that anonymous translation. Now, before we do a little taste test so you can see the difference, I want to read you something from Robin Buss's introduction. I absolutely adore reading a translator's rationale for their choices, because you'll often find in those translators' prefaces that the gloves come off. Translators often feel like they're really up for a fight, and that should be no surprise to anybody who has fallen in love with a work of literature. You want to fight for your love, you want to defend it and protect it because you want others to share your love. And so that explains the rather aggressive tone. Here's translator Robin Buss speaking of the anonymous translation upon which so many new translations are based. Buss writes, "Anyone who has read The Count of Monte Cristo only in this classic version has never read Dumas' novel. For a start, the translation is occasionally inaccurate and is written in a 19th century English that now sounds far more antiquated than the French of the original does to a modern French reader." Buss calls the style of this translation both irritating and antiquated, and it has the authentic creak of the Victorian stage boards and the gaslit melodrama. Not only that, but there is a huge number of omissions and bolderizations of Dumas' text. We see in that anonymous translation that Dumas' text has been transformed into something simpler, less complex, less rich in allusions, but more concentrated in plot and action. The 1846 translator already has an idea of what kind of novel this is, and that dictates what he or she can afford to omit. Travelogue, classical references, sexual and psychological analysis, and so on. None of these is essential to the plot of a thriller, and if some of them will embarrass English readers, then why leave them in? The only problem is that nearly 150 years later, we do not have quite the same idea of what is and what is not important. And so Buss felt that it was high time to go back to Dumas entire and unexpurgated. Buss's translation aims to, above all, be accurate and readable. A great deal of nonsense is written about translation, particularly by academics, who approach it either as a terrain for theoretical debate or, worse still, as a moral issue. Such academic theorists insist that a translation must read like a translation. It is somehow immoral to conceal the process that has gone into making it. Ordinary readers usually demand the opposite, and reviewers in quite respectable papers sometimes show little appreciation of what the process means and involves. Above all, I want to convey some of the pleasure of reading Dumas to those who cannot do so in the original language. Sounds like a translator after my own heart. Now let's compare two translations. Let's compare Robin Buss's and the one based on the anonymous translation. So here's the taste test. This is the Robin Buss translation available in Penguin paperback. In answer to the question of whether he has some kind of ambition, the Count of Monte Cristo says, "Yes, I do have one. Like every other man, at least once in his life, I too have been carried up by Satan to the highest mountain on earth. Once there, he showed me the whole world and, as he did to Christ, said to me, 'Now, Son of Man, what do you want if you are to worship me?' So I thought for a long time. because in reality a terrible ambition had long been devouring my soul. Then I answered him, "Listen, I have always heard speak of Providence, yet I have never seen her or anything that resembles her, which makes me think that she does not exist. I want to be Providence, because the thing that I know which is finest, greatest, and most sublime in the world is to reward and to punish." But Satan bowed his head and sighed. "You are wrong," he said. "Providence does exist, but you cannot see her, because, as the daughter of God, she is invisible, like her Father. You have seen nothing that resembles her, because she proceeds by hidden means and walks down dark paths. All that I can do for you is to make you one of the agents of this Providence. The deal was concluded. I shall perhaps lose my soul." Monte Cristo continued, "But what matter? If the deal had to be struck over again, I should do it." So I chose that passage because it's a personal favourite of mine, and I think you'll agree that that's really compelling stuff. Now, let's have a look at that anonymous translation, or a translation based on the anonymous one by comparison, which goes like this. In response to the question of whether he has an ambition, he says, "I have, sir. I, too, as happens to every man once in his life, have been taken by Satan into the highest mountain in the earth. And when there he showed me all the kingdoms of the earth. And as he said before, so said he to me, Child of earth, what wouldst thou have to make thee adore me? I reflected long, for a gnawing ambition had long preyed upon me. And then I replied, Listen. I have always heard tell of Providence, and yet I have never seen him, nor anything that resembles him, or would make me believe that he exists. I wish to be Providence myself, for I feel that the finest, noblest, most sublime thing in the world is to recompense and punish. Satan bowed his head and groaned. You are mistaken, he said. Providence does exist, only you have never seen him, because the child of God is as invisible as the parent. You have seen nothing that resembles him, because he works by secret springs and moves by hidden ways. All I can do for you is to make you one of the agents of that providence. The bargain was concluded. I may sacrifice my soul, but what does that matter? Added Monte Cristo. If the thing were to do again, I would again do it. Now keep in mind that there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to your preference. Go for the translation that most speaks to you, captivates you. Go for the one that fires your imagination. Now I think you can tell that there is a difference between the translations. The Robin Buss is very modern, it feels very accessible, and the anonymous translation in the Oxford World's Classics edition is antiquated. The syntax is a bit strange. There are some odd inversions that aren't very natural. There's some difficult lexical choice, words that we wouldn't use naturally. So it really depends what flavour you like. The older one, speaking in its benefit, could sound more poetic, but I do think the Robin Buss is more accessible. And please do let us know which one you prefer, which one you're going to opt for. But for now, let's talk about how to engage with the work. My recommendation is to read the Count of Monte Cristo with an awareness of the first reader. I've personally long found that having some awareness of the original publication history only increases our appreciation of these great books. And the Count of Monte Cristo was published in serial form. As you may already know, I'm a huge fan of serialized literature and following along with original serialized publication schedules. I've done this quite endlessly. I always have a Charles Dickens work on the go, following the original monthly instalments or weekly instalments. We've had read-alongs at the Hardcore Literature Book Club following Henry James's The Turn of the Screw in original serialized publication form. We have a year-long read following George Eliot's Middlemarch. There is a different feeling when you follow along in serialized fashion, because you necessarily have to slow down, you're exercising portion control, you're delaying your gratification, and then some truly magical things happen in the space that opens up. When you introduce time, insights arise. And what do you do in between installments? Well, you talk to other readers, you discuss the latest events, the cliffhangers, you hypothesize about what might happen, you talk about the characters, and this is how you live the great books. And as a culture, we are yearning for a return to the episodic, for a return to delayed gratification. There was a short stint where binging was all the rage. We would watch a television series all in one go. Popular streaming platforms would dump the entire season and you could just binge it in a night or two. And then we discovered that immediate gratification actually wasn't that gratifying or satisfying. And now we see that the streaming platforms have returned to this serialized approach, portioning out their most popular series, and viewers are happier because you can live the series. We actually do not want to binge through things. We don't want things to end. Anytime you find yourself reaching the end of your favourite book, take a note of how you feel. Do you feel excited? Do you feel happy? Or do you find yourself slowing down? Do you find yourself feeling sad? Do you end the book with a bittersweet note? Because yes, it's wonderful to complete a work, but we know we love a work when we don't want the book to end. And one of the amazing things about the Count of Monte Cristo in particular is, yes, it's long. The Penguin edition is more than 1,200 pages, but it's one of those books like Don Quixote that we don't want to end. It could have been longer. We could go on reading it quite endlessly. Why do we go on a journey? It's not to get to the destination. It's what we learn and what we enjoy and what we experience along the way. And so I think that reading literature in serial form is good for the soul. It's also a great way to just be able to read more books. If you mix up your input, if you mix up how you're exposed to these stories, you can read multiple books simultaneously. You can have one book on audio, you can have one book that you're reading serially, you can have one book that you can binge to your heart's content. And Alexandre Dumas was writing prolifically during the heyday of serialized literature, the dawn of the serial story. I'm absolutely obsessed with this moment of history, and if I had a time machine, I would love to go back to the early 19th century and wander through the Parisian streets and spend some time in the cafes and take note of what everyone was talking about, because at the time, when The Count of Monte Cristo was coming out, it was like having a really gripping, compelling television series, and everybody was following along with it. It was the talk of the town. Yes, reading is a solitary activity, but I personally find it more rewarding when you are sharing the story with another. The Count of Monte Cristo was serialized in a periodical, a newspaper, between the 28th of August 1844 and the 15th of January 1846. You'll notice that it was serialized across 2 years. And it was published in volume form around the same time across 18 volumes. We see the rise of the serial in the 1830s when cheap newspapers like Le Siècle and La Presse, which relied on advertising revenue, needed to get their circulation up, and so the editors of these periodicals discovered that they could increase their circulation numbers by running novels, stories, in serial form, because readers would want to buy the next paper and the one after that to see what happened in their favourite story. And things got a little bit dirty in the publishing world, and there were bidding wars. There were rival newspapers competing with one another, trying to poach the top talent, the top writers, and of course one of the top talents was Alexandre Dumas, who was spinning many different fictional plates at the same time, writing multiple stories simultaneously, typically around 4 simultaneously, for as many different newspapers. Alexandre Dumas would work for 14 hours a day, and he would sacrifice sleep in order to keep up with this hectic pace. There's a caricature of the writer at the time with a pen in both hands and a servant ladling soup into his mouth as a funny explanation for how he kept up this white-hot flash of productivity. He would sleep in 5-minute snatches, falling asleep for 5 minutes and then getting up and then going straight back to his writing. Now, an integral part of Dumas' writing process involved working with collaborators, researchers, ghostwriters, we might say. That was how Alexandre Dumas was able to become a fiction factory with over 600 books to his name. He would write plays, he would write historical novels, he would write travel logs, and he would write adventure stories like the Count of Monte Cristo, but he needed help. Many have used this to detract from Dumas, but Alexandre Dumas had something of a golden touch. Without his spark of life, the stories would not be what they were, but yes, his collaborators were a really important part of the composition process, and I do not think this should detract from our appreciation of his work, because if it does, why then we cannot appreciate William Shakespeare. The fact of the matter is, the history of literature is the history of collaboration. Now, I use the term fiction factory in an endearing way because I really admire prolific output. I admire that work ethic. That really inspires me. But the term fiction factory was originally used in a denigrating way by a journalist who attempted to expose Dumas' writing practices. Now, Dumas took this journalist to court and ended up winning. Working closely with collaborators is, of course, just a very sensible business move because it enabled Dumas to bring out more stories, to captivate his audience with more tales, more characters, and so we're all better off for it. His main collaborator was a man called Auguste Maquet. They worked very closely together on many of his best stories, including the Count of Monte Cristo. They would workshop the plot together. You might envision a modern-day television writer's room, and indeed Maquet would help with the historical details. And these historical details were a very important part of the frame. That's the key word. Dumas wanted just enough of a flavour of historical accuracy so that his readers would feel all the more immersed in a real world. In Dumas' Mes Memoirs, he writes, "I start by devising a story. I try to make it romantic, moving, dramatic, and when scope has been found for the emotions and the imagination, I search through the annals of the past to find a frame in which to set it. And it has never happened that history has failed to provide this frame. So exactly adjusted to the subject that it seemed it was not a case of the frame being made for the picture, but that the picture had been made to fit into the frame." Now, I've recommended reading serially, and many readers do find it rewarding to follow the original serialised publication of The Count of Monte Cristo. You can find information about the original schedule online, and it was published across 139 instalments. As you can tell, that will take you rather a long time. Now, at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, I will still encourage this serial reading, but we will be taking this book across roughly 10 weeks. The Penguin edition has 1,240 or so pages, which makes this a big book. But the key when it comes to getting through big books is to break it down into manageable chunks. We will be leveraging roughly 100 or so pages per lecture. And for those following along in real time, these will be spaced out at a pace of a little over a week between lectures, which will get us through the book at a very nice pace. I personally recommend portioning out 10 pages per day to read this book, which is quite manageable. As always, I encourage readers to embrace the pace that comes most naturally to them. If that's too quick of a pace, then feel free to slow it down. Enjoy the process. If that's too slow of a pace, then I encourage rereading, building your rereading in, journaling, answering our discussion questions along the way, following rabbit holes, because along the way I'm going to be recommending documentaries, books, music, different things that you can explore to increase your appreciation, and of course you can layer in other stories too. In the same way that I don't think there's a right or wrong translation, I also don't think there is a one-size-fits-all pace. It's a build your own adventure. Every book is an adventure that's unique to you. And speaking of adventure, The Count of Monte Cristo is a really compelling adventure story, and my next recommendation is to use your reading as a chance to pull apart, examine and appreciate the mechanics of really great storytelling. We have Alexandre Dumas to thank for popularising the cliffhanger, and that's the real difficulty when it comes to pacing. Once you get into it, slowing down and reading just 10 pages per day may prove to be rather difficult because you're going to want to inhale it. You're going to be hit with cliffhanger after cliffhanger, nail-biting tension, and you're going to want some of that suspense resolved. You're going to want to keep reading on. But what I implore you to do is to Pause, slow down, and think about why you want to read on. Try to figure out, how is this suspense created? How is this excitement created? And indeed, this is a good exercise to do if you are a storyteller yourself, because you will figure out what sells. We're appreciating popular fiction here, and I think that there surely has to be a little bit of jealousy involved when the critics scorn popular works, as though pleasing a huge audience is an easy feat. One way that critics have historically denigrated this work is by calling it children's literature. Firstly, the Count of Monte Cristo isn't children's literature. That wasn't Alexandre Dumas' intended audience when he wrote it. But even if it were, children's literature is, of course, one of the most difficult things to write and get right. But indeed, such a denigrating charge is actually a compliment in disguise, because critics are then saying this is a captivating story. Behind all of the excitement, the disguises, the plotting and scheming, the treasure, behind all of that, there is ultimately a very rich storytelling tradition running through the Count of Monte Cristo. Biblical and Shakespearean allusions aside, Alexandre Dumas ultimately gifted us a brilliant romance. Now indeed, when we talk about romance, we're not actually talking about love, though that might be one facet of it. We're talking about stories preoccupied with the old notions of chivalry, in which deeds of love and deeds of arms are bound up in one another. These old romances are about honour, they're about justice, they're often about divine retribution, they're often moral tales. They're about putting oneself in service to a greater aim, one that is greater than ourselves. And so Alexandre Dumas is a romantic writer in that sense, but he's also romantic in the 19th century sense of the word too. And that can mean many things. That often means melodrama. That means an emotional roller coaster. That means Byronic tragic heroes. That means tension, that means exotic locales, secret passages, sublime mountains, fortresses, and islands shrouded in mystery. One reads the Count of Monte Cristo and one sees that Dumas, whose own life was of course an adventure in and of itself, one sees that Dumas was clearly enamoured with the stories of Napoleonic campaigns. He also loved the tales from the 1001 Nights, all of that comes through. I also love what Robin Buss has to say about Romanticism, because during the time of Dumas' writing there was a battle between Classicism and Romanticism, and Buss perfectly outlines the differences between the two rival literary ideologies, which were engaged in a mock heroic combat for the soul of French literature in the early 19th century. Classicism stood for universal themes, refinement, purity of language, clear division of literary genres. Romanticism meant energy, modern subject matter, mixing genres and openness to foreign influences, particularly that of Shakespeare, the romantic dramatist par excellence. Simply put, when you pick up the Count of Monte Cristo, you're in for a rip-roaring adventure story. And because this is a rip-roaring read, I would like to make another recommendation, and that is to be wary of spoilers if this is your first read. Of course, this may be a reread for you. This is definitely one of those books that you want to reread endlessly over the course of your life. But if this is your first reading, protect yourself. Don't look things up. Don't type things into the internet because you might have things spoiled for you. Yes, you probably know the outline of the story, the broad strokes. You've probably seen some movie adaptations when you were younger, but even the greatest adaptations differ quite drastically from the original, which is richer and much more rewarding, even though there are some good adaptations, of course. So I'm going to be personally very careful over the course of our lecture series to not give away anything that spoils the plot, because it is plot driven. There's two types of story. There's the plot driven story and there's the character driven story. Now, the characters are fantastic. You'll fall in love with the characters, but we read because the plot drags us along. And so we need to be wary of things that spoil the plot. For the vast majority of classic literature, I don't really believe in spoilers, because I don't think we read a lot of great books to find out what happens next. As Dr. Samuel Johnson said of Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, we read for the sentiment, not the story. If we're reading Dostoevsky, we're reading primarily for psychological and spiritual insight. If we're reading Shakespeare, we're once again reading for that psychological complexity, and we're reading to appreciate grand poetry, sublime poetry. But when it comes to the Count of Monte Cristo, you do want to protect yourself, because we really are reading to find out what happens next. That's part of the joy for a reader's first reading of this book. Now, another thing that is going to make your reading all the more rewarding is learning about Alexandre Dumas himself. What a fascinating man. I absolutely adore this man. I love reading about his life almost as much as I love reading his stories. Emeritus Professor of French Literature David Coward puts it best in his introduction to the OUP edition when he says that Alexandre Dumas was a force of nature, a robust, roaring man of vast appetites and even vaster energies. He cries out to be measured in cubits rather than the feet and inches which are used for mere mortals. For 40 years, sparks from his mighty anvil lit fires which inflamed the world and burn still. Alexandre Dumas was born in 1802 in a royalist village roughly 50 miles north of Paris. Now, I stress the fact that his hometown was royalist because his surname would have had a distinctly Bonapartist ring to it. Indeed, if you want to learn about Dumas' life, you should really begin by learning about his father's life, because he most certainly could have been a character in one of his son's books too. I highly recommend a biography by Tom Rees called The Black Count, if you want to learn more about this man who was one of Napoleon's generals, though indeed Napoleon Bonaparte and Dumas' father fell out, which resulted in him not receiving the military pay and pension, and when he died he left his family, his son, his wife, in a rather impoverished condition. Dumas was actually Alexander's grandmother's name. His father, Thomas Alexander, was born in Saint Domingo in 1786, son to a slave called Marie Cécette Dumas. And so his father took his mother's name and enlisted as a private soldier, and then rose through the ranks in Revolution-era France. When his father passed away, Alexander was presented with a choice. Did he want to change his name and have a name that sounded a little bit more aristocratic, or at least not so Bonapartist, or did he want to keep his grandmother's name, a name that would have made many think of a general in Bonaparte's army, and thus make it rather difficult for him to find employment under the Bourbon Restoration? He of course chose to keep the name Dumas. Indeed, some knowledge of the Napoleonic era will be indispensable when it comes to increasing your appreciation of the Count of Monte Cristo, which opens in 1815. Napoleon is just about to leave exile on the island of Elba, kicking off the period known as the 100 Days. And indeed, we've had a lot of discussion about Napoleon at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and so this is going to give us another great chance to really flesh out our knowledge of a fascinating historical period. And this book makes a great addition to two books that we've already enjoyed together. That's Tolstoy's War and Peace and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. In addition to increasing your historical understanding, it will also be rewarding to look at the inspiration for the story. In 1857, in an article called The Real Life Monte Cristo, Dumas outlined where the spark of inspiration for the story had arisen. He was accompanying Prince Napoleon on a sailing trip to Elba in 1842. He caught sight of the island of Monte Cristo, and he promised the prince that he would write a novel in which the island featured. A year later, he signed a contract with a publisher for an 8-volume set of essentially travel and historical guides. He received an advance, and before he had even begun writing, the publishers said that given the popularity of Eugene Sue's The Mysteries of Paris, which was published serially to great success, they said that they now wanted a novel. Dumas was only happy to oblige, and he went back to an anecdote that he had found from the writings of a former police archivist, an anecdote that had really captured his imagination. The real-life story was called Revenge and the Diamond. And this story was about 4 friends, three of whom become jealous of one of the friends when he announces his plans to marry into a large dowry to a woman called Marguerite. And so they put a plan together to denounce their friend, Francois Picot, as an English spy. Picot was arrested and disappeared, imprisoned for 7 years. During his imprisonment, he befriended another prisoner, a cleric from Milan, who became something of a father figure to him. And before he died, he made over his fortune to Picot, which included 3 million gold coins. Picot returned to Paris, a very rich man, and he learned that Marguerite had waited for him for 2 years, but had ultimately married his so-called friend, Mathieu Lupion, one of the friends who had jealously schemed to denounce him and get him out of the picture. What happened next was a riveting story of disguised identity, murder and revenge. And Picot went through and ticked off each man as he got his revenge one by one. Number 1 down, number 2 down, number 3 down. Now it's no surprise why this story in particular captured Alexandre Dumas' imagination. It was Shakespeare's Hamlet, the ultimate story of revenge, that actually made him want to be a writer in the first place. When he saw Hamlet for the first time, it was a life-changing experience, and proved to be the catalyst for Dumas going into the theatre, because he was a dramatist primarily before being a novelist. He would write in Mes Memoirs that the scenes in Hamlet shook him to his core from this time on, but only then did I have an idea of what the theatre could be, and out of all the broken fragments of the past I glimpsed the possibility of creating a world. So Hamlet, coupled with that police archivist's anecdote, inspired Dumas, and he took that and he was away, writing furiously. He began writing with the part of the story we now have as chapter 31, which is 300 pages into the book, a quarter of the way through the story. Dumas showed the story to his collaborator, Maquet, who wanted to know why he had omitted the most dramatic parts of the story. The betrayal, the imprisonment, the idea to seek revenge brewing, and of course the escape. Dumas had originally thought that he would introduce this information by way of recall, memory and discussion, but Maquet said no, go back and write it and get that drama nailed down, and thank goodness he did, because it's really compelling stuff, really exciting stuff, and these scenes would end up being some of the most iconic in the book. I absolutely adore all of the novel, and I only get more and more invested as we go through, but the beginning is very important. It's a little bit exposition heavy at the beginning, but it needs to be, and you need to become invested. And then I think we really end up relating to the pain of Edmond Dantès when he is imprisoned, and that feeling, we engage with that feeling of needing to forge ourselves and needing to break free. What we get at the beginning would prove to be an inspiration for countless superhero stories in the 20th century, like Batman, for example. And what is the most compelling part of any superhero story, hero's journey or quest narrative? Is when the hero is building themselves up, training and working, typically with a guide, with an aid. Let's have a moment of appreciation for Abbé Faria, who is responsible for helping Edmond transform. There are a few passages that can compete with the chapter called An Italian Scholar when it comes to motivating us to keep reading. Yes, we're reading at the moment, but who among us won't feel as though we want to read all the more voraciously after being privy to Edmond's and Abbé Faria's discussion? Do you have any books? Edmond asks. In Rome, the Abbé Faria says, I had nearly 5,000 volumes in my library. By reading and rereading them, I discovered that 150 books, carefully chosen, give you, if not a complete summary of human knowledge, at least everything that is useful for a man to know. This is a brilliant mindset shift, and it's absolutely true. 150 well-chosen books give one almost a complete knowledge of everything one needs to know, and you just reread them endlessly. I devoted 3 years of my life to reading and rereading these 150 volumes so that when I was arrested, I knew them more or less by heart. In prison, with a slight effort of memory, I recalled them entirely. Increasingly astonished, Edmond began to consider this man's faculties almost supernatural. Now, I think if you bring yourself fully to this work, you will not be able to help yourself become invested. But whilst you're getting into it, my advice to you is to really think about how this all applies to your life. Remember, you want to live the great books. Think about how the themes inform your understanding of the world, human psychology, and your own process of rebirth and your own process of breaking free, whatever that is. We've spoken before about the hero's journey, going on a quest, and this is rather similar. I think we will all relate to Edmond Dantès at some point in our life, and the reason why I love this romantic Superman. What I love about Edmond Dantès is he uses his time imprisoned to forge his mind. And then when it comes to the revenge, he is yet again using his mind. He starts the story as being rather naive, but being imprisoned for a crime you didn't commit for years and years on end will do powerful things to one if you allow it to. And he starts to understand what motivates other people. He can use his awareness of the psychology of others to trap them. And we do see reviewers of this story talking about, I don't understand why he took revenge. It doesn't really make any sense. Well, if you were locked up for a crime you didn't commit for 14 years and you had everything taken away from you, I think you would start to understand. But of course, part of the journey involves working through and discovering whether vengeance is ultimately satisfying. Is that a satisfying way to orient one's life? It can be hugely motivational, but over the course of your reading, you might want to ponder whether revenge is a worthy mission and goal in and of itself, and if there is not something more divine that we could choose in its place. Now, of course, Edmond Dantès, or the Count of Monte Cristo, will see himself as the divine hand of providence. He sees himself as a channel for God's vengeance, but perhaps we should keep in mind the biblical quote, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay." There's this idea that we are not the ones responsible for wreaking revenge on another on behalf of God. Ultimately, external battles are subservient to our internal battles. We all love a good revenge story because we've all felt the pain of injustice. We've all wanted to right a wrong. And we think of the Sicilian proverb, revenge is a dish best served cold. That's what this story is about. That's the kind of revenge we're going to get. And whilst that may motivate us, ultimately along the way, Alexandre Dumas implores us to question whether that truly is a worthy way to orient ourselves in the world. Now, I'd like to end with one more tip, perhaps the most important tip, and that is to really make a meal out of this book. Discuss it with others, discuss it with a great group, discuss it with loved ones. Find somebody you can read it with and discuss it with in the spirit of the first reader. You get so much more out of these great books when you share it with another. Make your solitary reading communal. We all love curling up with a good book by ourselves, it's an escape, but the joy of a great book is then emerging from that solitude and discussing it with another, because then we start to see all these different insights by virtue of another's point of view, their lived experience, their background that we might not have seen the first time. And so we crowdsource meaning when we read with a great group. And if you would like to read with a truly marvellous community of lovers of great literature, then please go to patreon.com/hardcore literature and join the read along of the Count of Monte Cristo with the Hardcore Literature Book Club. You remember what you talk about with another, and the more you discuss a work, the more resonant it becomes, the more rewarding it becomes, the more meaningful and unforgettable it becomes. And so this is going to be a fantastic adventure. This is such a good read. We're going to have a lot of fun with this one. And so I would like to end today by putting a question out to you. Are you preparing for your first read of the Count of Monte Cristo, or are you gearing up for a reread? What is your experience with this book? If you've read it before, then remaining spoiler free, of course, what advice would you give to other readers to get all the more out of it? What do other readers have to look forward to? And indeed, if this is your first reading, then let us know what you are looking forward to with the Count of Monte Cristo. Thank you very much for watching today. I hope you have a lovely day and happy reading. Bye bye for now.